So welcome everyone, and thank you all very much for venturing out in such dismal weather. You should be congratulated, I think. I should begin by introducing myself. I'm the physical secretary and the vice president here. My name's Martin Taylor. As I say, you're all very welcome indeed here tonight. If I could encourage you, though, could you be just a little bit more welcome yet if you'd very kindly switch off your mobile phones, pagers, or any other potential noisemakers that you might have with you. Thank you. So the title of this evening's event is Proofreading, Telling Stories with Numbers, Telling Stories with Words. And the first thing I want to say is that this event is one in a series of annual joint meetings that we organise here in partnership with the Royal Society of Literature. And we're delighted to have with us here down there on the front row Anne Chisholm, who's chair of the Royal Society of Literature, and she will be saying a few words at the end. Anyway, back to tonight's event. This will take the form of a conversation and discussion between Mark Haddon and Marcus du Sautoy over there. But before we get underway, I just wanted to say a few words of introduction about each of our so-called conversationalists. Mark Haddon, of course, sprang to fame in, I think it was about 2003, with his book, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time. And the story is narrated by Christopher, an intelligent, autistic boy who's investigating with what I think is of amazing persistence the murder of his next-door neighbour's dog. As well as writing, Mark's also worked as a cartoonist, which I didn't know, and he's also a keen mathematician, which at least I would have guessed from having read the book. In fact, I first encountered Mark's book on I think it was the BBC's Book at Bedtime. Anyway, it was read to me. And when you first hear it like that, you miss out on lots of the mathematical nuances. So, for instance, I didn't realise that the chapters were ordered by prime numbers. The broadcast did, though, have a very positive effect. It sort of made me resolve to want to read the book. And then a few weeks later, a lady in Philadelphia gave me a copy of the book, which was a very good thing. But then a rather bad thing happened. She said, and it'll do you a lot of good to read it, Martin. And as soon as someone tells you a book will do you good, you think, ugh, and you put it to one side. And so it went to one side for a little time. But then I read it. And I enjoyed the story again, but I really enjoyed the mathematics. And there was a lovely Royal Society angle in all of this, because our previous president, Lord May, Robert May as he's called in the book, there's a lovely bit of feature about his work, and that's a real highlight. Anyway, I turn now from Mark to Marcus. And the first thing to say about Marcus du Sautoy is that he's really a very old friend of the Royal Society. We go back a long time. He was one of our research fellows here, and coming to a more immediate time, he was here with me in this very lecture theatre, giving a public talk on symmetry. I didn't check it out, but it would have been a few months ago, I think we can agree. Several months ago, let's go. I'll settle for that, yes. So we see a lot of Marcus here at the Royal Society, and we're very happy about that. Marcus, though, has a proper job as well. He's a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, and he's also recently been an EPSRC Media Fellow. He too is a writer, and he's written the best-selling popular maths book, The Music of the Primes. My notes tell me that he's lectured to a wide range of audiences that extend from diplomats to prison inmates. Presumably not at the same time necessarily, but it sort of makes you seem like a mathematical Johnny Cash in some way. I'm very impressed by this. Anyway, I know that Marcus is particularly concerned that school children should be taught to appreciate what we might call the big stories of maths and the romance and mystery of numbers. Currently, we see him regularly on the BBC4 series, The Story of Maths, and he certainly put over, I think, the romance and mystery extremely well there. You may also have heard that recently Marcus got appointed to the Simonyi Professorship for Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford. I learnt about this by various means, but in particular, I heard you on the Today programme only a little time ago, being interviewed by John Humphreys. I think this is tremendous news because, as I'm sure you'll hear in a few minutes, Marcus has got tremendous passion and energy as well as a great ability to communicate. So that's good for science. But the thing I haven't told you yet is that I'm a mathematician, and I just think it's so great for mathematics to have such a champion. So that's great. I think that's enough from me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my very great pleasure to present Mark Haddon and Marcus du Sautoy.
Mark and I are going to have a conversation together for about half an hour, and then I'm going to open up the floor to involve you in the conversation as well. Slightly strange to be having a conversation with one person with a lot of people overhearing it, but it's interesting that next year is the 50th anniversary of C.P. Snow's Two Cultures, which sort of lamented the fact that the sciences and the arts didn't really have much contact with each other. But actually, I think 50 years on, we see so many more examples of collaborations, the artists being interested in science, science getting involved in collaborations. I mean, what's your view of this collaboration? Is it sort of healthy for both sides? Are there interesting things coming out of it?
I'm a little bit sceptical, actually, about this sort of the contemporary obsession with not so much art about science and science about art, but about collaboration and overlap. I mean, I'm an artist and I'm fascinated by science. I love art about science. I think if you send a poet to Jodrell Bank, great. Or if you're a scientist and you're talking about the mathematics of equal temperament in music or the psychology of reading poetry, whatever, that's really fascinating. But when people talk about the overlap between the two, how much we have in common, which I do hear about, I always think it's like someone talking about America and China and saying, look, they do the same things. They all have toothbrushes and bicycles and outlets at McDonald's. And I think that's the least interesting thing about these two great cultures. So I'm sceptical about the overlap. And I often wonder if collaboration between the two is not real collaboration. It's artists using scientists to get a bit of interesting subject matter, or scientists getting artists in, particularly to help convey their message to the outer world. So I wanted to ask you about the overlap. I mean, are there things that are different, much more interesting than the things that are the same? And maybe you can talk about the romance and mystery of maths. But first I was going to ask you about collaboration, because Marcus has recently been the mathematical consultant on Théâtre de Complicité's A Disappearing Number. Just to be contentious, was it a collaboration, or were you the sort of renter mathematician who was able to provide interesting numbers for them?
I mean, I do certainly feel that. I mean, I'm involved with a lot of collaborations with composers and sculptors, and Complicité asked me in because they wanted to do this play exploring Hardy's A Mathematician's Apology. And I certainly recognise that feeling of artists are after interesting things to plunder from the scientific world, interesting structures. But I don't think that's such a bad thing. And what I liked about Complicité's approach to this play was that they really wanted to somehow embed the mathematics inside the play, and it to genuinely play a role in the structure of the play and to talk about it. I think they were very negative about, there's a play called Proof, which a film was made, and Proof talks about mathematicians but never talks about the mathematics. It's somehow not important. They want to just interestingly talk about mathematicians as kind of crazy characters. And I guess that's something that's interesting in the book The Curious Incident, that mathematics does, I think, play a very active role in the narrative. I mean, you're using, it's not just about somebody who's, you could have just stopped at saying, okay, well, I'm going to have a character who likes maths, but we're never ever going to go into the maths. But for you, I think it obviously was important that what he was thinking about. I mean, is that...
As you were talking, I had one of those thoughts you only get live on stage, which doesn't happen very often. I just feel like some of it is my fault, isn't it? The art.
Exactly, yes.
I'm sorry. What's interesting about the maths in there is it was one of those very, very rare occurrences. Where if you're interested in maths, you can put maths in a novel. And one of those very rare occurrences where you can do it organically. Because I had a character with a biographical narrative, but because of his mental peculiarities, he was obsessed by maths. And he liked the idea of breaking up a narrative. It seemed entirely natural to him to stop a story and then talk about maths. In personal terms, when I look at the book, I realise what I've done is found a sneaky way of working out one of my own personal failings as a writer. I know in writing, in most of art, you must, and this is one of the great differences, I think, you must try never to explain. Explanation is kind of the death of literature. When Keats said, we hate poetry that has a palpable design on us. Yeah. And if we can feel a writer trying to make us see things in a certain way, you know, we turn off.
Yeah.
But I love that kind of writing. I love explaining things. And previously I'd written novels in which there was just too much explaining. And my best editor, my wife, used to read it and say, you know, you just need to shut up and stop talking about yourself more often and your own opinions. Just paint a picture and let it happen. And in Curious, I was allowed to paint the picture and let it happen, and then to sort of indulge my personal obsession with explanation.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think that is a real, genuine difference between a scientist and a mathematician and somebody in the creative arts. Because for me, it's really important to have as much explanation to make everyone think the same thing. That somehow ambiguity is an anathema to a mathematician. It's very, very... I mean, I don't mind if people have other ideas whilst they're listening to a proof or something, but I think that you really want to get everybody understanding the same idea. Whilst, you know, the creative people I work with, they say, well, actually, I don't want that. I want sort of many interpretations to be had. And I think that's one thing I found very nice in Curious Incident. It was, because it was quite a neutral sort of character, you ended up putting a lot of different interpretations.
There was a lot of space in there, deliberately a lot of space. Something that someone told me at a reading 2 years after the book came out was that there was no reference to what Christopher looked like. And they said, what do you think Christopher looks like? And I said, I have no idea. It's never even occurred to me, because I spent so long in the mind of that character, and he's not interested in what he looks like. He never looks in a mirror. But everyone who read it had a picture of exactly who he was.
Yeah.
I was going to try and do a little bit of audience interaction here, but I'll start by saying, to go back to what we were saying about the way that maths and science and philosophy as well tries to narrow things down to one statement that can be defended. I always think of it as the Clintonian mode of address. When you say, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, you're not talking to the woman on the tooting bendy bus, because whenever a normal person listens, they just think you're just lying through your teeth, aren't you? When you're using that mode of address, you're addressing the lawyers that are going to attack you when you're in the witness box. It doesn't matter what the public think about what you say, but you need to defend it against professionals. And in a way, when you make a proof, you have to defend it against professionals.
Yes, yes.
But I think the opposite is happening when you're writing something. You want to sort of as many interpretations as possible. There's a piece I often read out to creative writing students, and I'm going to read it to you now, and we're going to do a little experiment. So this better go correctly, or it'll really embarrass me.
Well, don't worry, experiments are like that. They can often go wrong.
It's just a paragraph. I'm going to read it out, and I want everyone to close their eyes. Okay? And I'll read it out, and then I want you to keep your eyes closed and just imagine this scene. He crushed the remains of the cigarette into the saucer and emptied the mug. Picking up his coat, he stepped outside and walked down the stone steps onto the little beach. The sky was orange, and a cool wind was blowing. Something caught his eye. There was an object in the water, 50, 60 yards out, now visible, now hidden by the little waves. Just remain in that scene for a little bit. And now open your eyes. And now when I read this out to people, I asked them questions like, if you could stick your hand up in answer to these questions, who thinks he was standing on a sandy beach? Or who thinks the beach was stony? Was he looking out across sort of the open ocean, or was it some kind of estuary with trees on the other side? Ocean? Anyone an estuary? Anyone think there are boats out in the water? Any boats? Empty water? And then it gets really weird. I often ask people what was in the mug. So who thinks coffee? Who thinks tea? Are there any whiskies here? Yeah, there's a whiskey down there. Does anyone think this person has a beard? Yeah. My point is, this is not a great piece of writing. I just knocked this up in 30 seconds. But it demonstrates something that all writers need to know. That when you're writing, the reader is going to do even more writing than you. You don't want to over-describe stuff. You want to leave space. And you want people to disagree, but in a really interesting way. Not disagree in the sense of I think it was rubbish and I think it was brilliant, but each to have an entirely different imaginative world in their heads once you've described it.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think, although we want to just give a message of one story in mathematics, I still think that there's a lot of sort of unexpected twists and turns, which I mean, I read proofs a little I do think they're like stories, and the really good mathematical proofs are those which have twists and turns in them, which are unexpected. I think I rather like this quote. I think it's Birtwistle who said, a piece of music fails if it ends in your head before it's actually finished. That you can predict what's going to happen. That's an uninteresting piece of music. And for me, mathematics, there's a lot of choices of the maths that we choose to write, enjoy, celebrate, and it has got quite a lot of narrative drive in it, and with these twists and turns and themes which interweave, almost like characters meeting, interacting, and finding themselves arriving somewhere different.
But funny, it does end like music, isn't it? You have a narrative, but it's not open-ended. Unless it's all gone wrong, you hope to revive at some point where you get closure. And what I noticed in the flyer for the event, is that you were talking about the romance and mystery of numbers. And I was thinking, how interesting. Those are two genres of writing in which you have closure at the end. Mystery, you always find out who killed the person. And romance, the girl and the guy get together.
Yeah, it's very true. Because, when I wrote the music of the primes, actually, I wanted to tell the story of the prime numbers. And in my head, I was always thinking of it a little bit like a murder mystery, that you're following on this pathway to try and actually, that book doesn't have a resolution. You never... And it's interesting, your book, The Curious Incident, is again a sort of detective or even the name of the story comes from.
Well, here's an interesting question. As a mathematician, can you remember the end? The last sentence was, gets his A-level and says, and now I can do anything. Was that happy resolution for you? Or was that profound ambiguity? Or ironic self-delusion?
No, I knew he was going to be in the department with me in a few years' time. That was where he was going to find us.
And I've talked to several other mathematicians, and they say exactly that. He'll get a decent job in a maths department.
Absolutely.
And he won't look too out of place either. But other people have read it and said that is so desperately sad. He's been wrong about so many human things. He's talking about himself. He's got to be wrong about that as well. See, I'm on the inside of the puppet show moving the sticks, so from my point of view, I wrote the last sentence as being deliberately ambiguous, so there isn't any real closure. But people's hunger for closure is so great, they just read their own ending into it. I get lots of letters from people saying, what a fantastically happy ending. And other people saying, I just wept the whole way through.
Oh, that's interesting, yeah. But there are a lot of examples of mathematics being written into novels, and they do tend to be sort of murder mysteries. Interesting. You think of the Oxford Murders. There's a new one, Pythagorean Crimes, as well. There seems to be, and that sort of desire to just unravel something and find out what's happening, I think, is the desire of the mathematician to sort of decode what's happening.
I'm going to dogleg back to something else you said, which made me think of something hopefully interesting. You were talking about music, and it made me think about the language we use in our heads, the metaphors we use to help us solve problems. I've been thinking about it a lot recently because I've been talking to my son, who's 7, and I'm quite interested in what happens in the head of children as they get older. And I said, how do you think? He's very, very good at history, not really interested in literature at all, but loves history. And he knows all these facts. I said, how do you arrange them in your head? He has a friend who's good at maths and arranges everything on shelves with drawers which he can pull out. And Alfie said, no, it's just like a ball pit at the soft play area. They're just all in a complete mess, but they're different colours. And I know that, like, the Tudors are red balls and the Romans are green balls, and I can pull them out. And he also has a constantly running video game in his head, but it's a historical beat-em-up kind of game. And sometimes he'll say to me, I'm walking to school, I can't talk to you now, I've got to hang back because I left it on a cliffhanger. I mentioned this to his headmistress, who said, that's really interesting. Do you know, several people have said this to me. I don't have anything in my head at all. She said, I just think and it comes out. I wondered if there are, and what made me think about it with music and with painting, you can't use metaphors. Really, you have to think of it in your head and think, does it sound good? Does it look good? But do you use pictures in your head or anything else to help you reach an answer?
Yeah, I think that point about language and articulating, finding some way of articulating what's going on is really important, because quite often when you're coming up with some mathematics, you've gone into the kind of this Buddhist meditation and things, and you're seeing these things beginning to form. But the really difficult thing is then kind of crystallizing that, trying to find out, because ultimately you have to write it in some sort of language which will communicate and bring the same idea alive in somebody else. And that very often... But I think that's musical ideas as well. You know, there's a moment of sort of connections and themes that you're seeing, and then you've got to make that commitment to actually putting it into music. I mean, what about for you when you're actually thinking of a story? Is the act of actually putting it down on the page easy or hard? Or
It's got much easier now, because I can sort of hear it in my head. I think when you start out as a writer, it's really, really hard, because you get this lovely, fluid language in your head. I'm sure everyone talks to themselves inside their head as if they are Virginia Woolf or Guy de Maupassant. And then they start putting it on paper and think, what is this rubbish I've written down? It's so clumsy. And when I read it out, it doesn't really work at all. And I think one of the ways you mature as a writer is you start out by thinking, I've got something in here, and it's... Apologies for thumping my microphone. You've got something in here and you want to get it down on paper, but you think the main relationship is between you and the paper. And in fact, you have to forget yourself and realise the main relationship is between the paper and someone else. And to do that, you have to kind of forget yourself, and you have to sort of get beyond everything in your head. Ultimately, all it comes down to is, does that sound good? And to do that, you have to forget that you're yourself. You have to think, I'm going into a bookshop, I'm taking this off the shelf, I open it up and I read it, and does it work?
Yeah.
And all those metaphors you use early on, all those rules, like don't explain everything, don't use too many adjectives, keep it simple, you forget those, and you get into the habit of writing it and then sitting back and reading it in your head, being two people almost simultaneously.
Is there a process of feeling like you want to tell the story first? I mean, for me, when I think there are three stages for me to understanding something. One is when I get it. The second one is when I get an opportunity to stand up in a seminar or at a conference, and then I've got my arms and non-verbal signs that I can send out, and I try and bring it alive in somebody else's head. That's like the storytelling of my idea. And then I've got to get to that stage where I've got to commit it to a paper that I send off to a journal, and that's when it's got to survive on its own in the bookshop, as you say, and somebody else is going to pick it up. I mean,
something like being a parent, is it the same? It's a bit like being a parent, isn't it? When you start out writing, it's like having really little kids, and you want to kind of fight their fights for them in the playground, and you're desperate for them to be in the nativity play and do really well. And then as you carry on writing, they start to look like teenagers, and they're big bruisers, and you think, no, you've just got to go out there in the world and fight your own corner, and if people don't like you, so what? You know, find the people who do like you.
Yeah, but I suppose, is there do you ever start telling the story to somebody, you know, for example, your partner, or is it very important that it's sort of kept there before you put it on? No, it has to be in my head.
I've got this strange rule, which I find quite hard to explain to everyone else, which is that if the idea seems really good in my head, if it's obviously good, then it won't work because everyone else will have already had it. The only ideas which work are the ones that you can just sort of smell or see that they might work, and you think, yes, I can see that that might work, but nobody else can. That's going to surprise people if I manage to pull that one together.
Yeah.
But it means that whenever I submit, I've worked in TV, and I've written screenplays and radio plays as well. I have to stop myself explaining to someone what I'm going to do, because they listen and I can see this glassy look come over their face. They're just thinking, that is a pile of rubbish. But in fact, the fact that it's a pile of rubbish is somehow an encouragement to me. I think, yes, you can't see the beauty of that. I'm onto a winner here.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I mean, when we were talking upstairs, we actually just started talking about music, and your musical interests in modern classical music, they were quite structural. I mean, you were interested in composers...
Germans and Russians, not the French.
Exactly.
Lovely country, but the music is just mushy.
Exactly. So that was interesting that you like things with structure in your music. Is that true also in the literature? I mean, are things very carefully structured that you write, or the things you like reading, do they have that same sort of structure that I recognise as a mathematician as something that I find appealing? No,
funny enough, and again, I only thought of it as you were saying it, my two favourite writers are James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. James Joyce is heavily structured, particularly in Ulysses, my favourite book. Structured at absolutely every level, or possibly too much structure. Virginia Woolf is incredibly free-flowing, especially into The Lighthouse and Jacob's Room and between the acts. She does this amazing thing where the narrator is kind of a sprite which moves around a room, in and out of people's head. It's first person, it's third person, completely structureless. Yeah. What I do like about my favourite books is that they're challenging. They do something that's quite difficult and they pull it off. Right. I hate just being told a story. And I often think of books like that as slightly journalistic, because they do exactly what we've been talking about. Someone has a story in their head and thinks, I'll just tell the story. The telling is so much more interesting than the story. Yeah, yeah.
And now, what about something like the Oulipo movement in, is that how you said? Oulipo?
That's the way I've always said it in my head.
Okay, right, yeah. I mean, this is a French movement of writers writing poetry and novels who are really using mathematical structures somehow to fix lots of constraints on their writing, in the hope, I guess, that they push themselves into something new that they would never have. I mean, do you think that's a...
Yes, and one good novel came out of it.
Oh, which one do you consider the good
rather
novel?
cattily. Yes, Georges Perec's Life a User's Manual.
Okay, yeah, and that's the one
which is set in a block of flats, isn't it? And there are many mathematical levels, but he moves a different character in each flat, and he moves around this flat by using knight's move. It's a chessboard of flats, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what's also interesting is it's based on something called a Latin Greco square, which is a bit like a Sudoku, early Sudoku. And he's basically it's a 10 by 10 grid, and you can if you have 10 regiments of an army and 10 ranks in that regiment, can you arrange them such that no row or column has the same regiment or rank in it? And basically, a 10 by 10 one, you can do it. 6 by 6 one, you can't do it. I mean, if you want to try this later, if you take a 4 by 4 one, so take 16 cards, the court cards in a pack of cards, and try and arrange them such that no row or no column has the same suit or the same rank in it, and that will have constructed a Latin Greco square 4 by 4 one. And what Perec does is to use a 10 by 10 one, which had only just been discovered, I think, and he constructs the whole of this novel going round he misses one room out. I think there are 99 rooms he visits in this apartment, and it sort of forces on him, this Latin Greco square, what should appear in that particular chapter. And it's interesting that those constraints presumably push him into somewhere new.
Yes, but I think in another book he demonstrated the shortcomings of that. I can't remember the title in French, but it was translated as a void in English, in which he doesn't... In the English version, there's no E in it.
Yeah, yeah.
And for him, it was a metaphor for the Holocaust, for something being missing from Central Europe. And I can understand that in a logical way, but when you read the book, you can see this structure, and you can see how hard it is to avoid one letter. But does that actually add to the experience? It always strikes me as like carrying a fridge up Everest. You know, it's really impressive, but, you know, does it add to the sum of human entertainment and edification?
Wasn't there recently somebody who wrote 5 chapters, and he only used words which had the vowels A in, and then E, and then I, O, and U. And he said
I'm sure there was.
Yeah.
The things people will do when they're searching for ideas. I think that's a case of... If you marry the maths and the literature too much, it's sort of at the expense of both. You need one type of process or another type of process, and they pull in very different ways.
Do you think there are any good examples of where mathematics or science in general have been used either in literature or theatre or... I mean, did you think it worked, Complicité's marrying of the mathematics, embedding it in there?
I thought, as an experience in the theatre, it was absolutely fantastic. And that's partly because Complicity could dramatise the phone book, frankly. They have this amazing stagecraft, amazing presence, lights, movement, everything. And there was real maths in there, wasn't there? But I thought in the attempt to squeeze them together, which was brilliantly done, if you looked carefully, there was sort of each side was sort of covering up slight cracks in the other. I thought the narratives weren't entirely convincing, maybe because I had a cynical writer's eye when I was watching, and I'm fascinated by theatre and when it works and when it doesn't. And there was real maths there, but it was mostly, a lot of it was raided for interesting metaphors, weren't there? Like the sort of different types of series. One became a metaphor for a baby growing in the womb, and another for a relationship which was dying. And
yeah.
I felt that was a slight abuse of the maths sometimes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or did you feel that was right? Do you like people taking metaphors from mathematical shapes?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I liked was, in a sense, the way they sort of fractured the play. So the play was in very many different bits, and it sort of mirrored the attempt to make infinite sums and things like that. So it was a play which sort of went for trying to realise mathematical structures inside the play. I mean, I don't think it was quite as successful, say, as Copenhagen, which I think, you know, Michael Frayn really uses the idea of an uncertainty principle. When you look at something, it somehow always seems to change. And I think that was probably an ultimately more successful piece of literature, using the science in a really interesting way. But,
maybe that will lead us on to talking. I wanted to ask you about the actual experience of the joy you get out of doing maths, and then the joy you get out of having done maths. At the moment, I'm writing a book which has 8 chapters, each in a different genre. Some are fictional, and one is an essay. It's about consciousness. So I'm knee-deep in Antonio Damasio and Daniel Dennett and Martin Chambers and people like that. And it's not some of it's scientific, but it's the same kind of thinking. And the sense I get when I'm doing it is of tunneling, of being in a very sort of enclosed space and moving very slowly one way and then thinking that's wrong, now I have to go this way. And it's difficult and it's slow, but it's also oddly comforting. It has the same sense of, I don't know if anyone else has felt this, of being in a cupboard when you're little, playing hide and seek, feeling sort of dark and secretive and contained. But when I'm writing the fictional chapters, it's being lost on a moorland, you know, because you could have to go anywhere. Am I meant to be over there, or am I meant to be over there?
Well, I think that's, again, this thing of constraints, you see. I find that's why I love I find mathematics a very creative thing. So there are lots of directions to go in, but I really enjoy the constraints of the logical environment, which mean I'm sort of pushed in certain directions, but I can make those choices about which directions I'm going to go.
Do you ever find it oddly comforting, or is it sometimes scary and lost?
Well, I mean, there are moments when you just don't know what's out there, and you have to make these imaginative leaps about where you're going to end up and try and make a connection between those. You can sort of see the mountain on the other side, and you've got to find that pathway to it, I think.
Something that struck me on the way here, let's talk about death, because whenever I'm talking about literature, I always end up talking about death. No, I don't mean actual death, although the actual death appears in literature a lot. Literature, I often think, is about death and the smaller deaths we go through, the things that really limit our lives. When you're a kid and reading literature, it's always about the door to the secret garden. It's always about the ability to go somewhere else and be perfectly free and not constrained. Whereas all good adult literature is about the fact that this is all we have. There is no get out. There is no other planet. It's about really appreciating the finiteness of life. One of the different things about maths is that you have something we don't have. If you produce a watertight, useful proof, you know, you've cheated death in a way.
Absolutely,
it will last forever in a way that no other human activity will.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, G.H. Hardy talked about, you know, any creative process, it's mathematics which will give you that sense of immortality. I mean, the things that the Greeks proved are as true today as they were 2,000 years ago. And I think that is something that, in a way, I think that's what Christopher was hankering after. I mean, he wants that security. He wants something that he knows will last. It won't change when you look at it in a different way. And I certainly recognise that it's a security thing that I was drawn to do mathematics, because and I also really appreciate the fact that you know, when you write a piece of literature, a lot of people are going to judge you. Some people hate it, some people love it. But mathematics has you don't have to speak up for it. It's true, it's there, and you proved it, and it can speak for itself.
There's a trade-off,
really
isn't there? You have a smaller audience, but you can
very
say,
small audience.
you can say, I was right to a smaller number of people.
Yeah,
I have a bigger audience, and a lot of them can say, no, that was complete rubbish.
What about those? I mean, for me, the buzz of doing mathematics is certain, and it's a drug, is getting that aha moment. When you know, I can work on something for absolutely ages, and then suddenly I see my way through it. And it's like being, you know, stuck in an awful tunnel, and you suddenly see the light, and you pop out the other side. I mean, do you get that buzz in writing?
Very occasionally, but it's on a small stylistic level. I mean, you can never see a book whole. I mean, the difference in with smaller proofs, but also with paintings and music, if you're writing a song, for example, you can step back and you see the whole canvas. If you're writing a novel, you never get to see the whole canvas. In a funny sort of way, I don't know what Curious Incident is like, because I haven't read it for 4 years. But even if I did, I wouldn't see the thing whole. But when you're talking about paragraphs or sentences, just occasionally it all falls into place, often after 30 or 40 drafts. And I think of it as the sound of a really expensive car door closing. In my head, I can almost hear it. You know, if you had a sort of top-of-the-range Mercedes and you just swung it shut and it would just go chunk. And that's a really nice feeling. But it's very, very rare.
Right, yeah. Perhaps we can open up the conversation and involve some of you in it as well. So we have a microphone which is going to wander around, and we already have a hand up here. So one microphone can go there, and if there's anybody else, and another microphone down here, and we'll take some questions and open up the conversation.
Thanks very much. I found myself wondering what the conversation would have been like if it had been taking place, for instance, in Greece, 2,000-odd years ago. Been reading a book recently by Richard B. Deacon. I'm I recall correctly, about the Alexandrian mathematician. I may be pronouncing this wrong. Hypatia or Hypatia?
Hypatia? Hypatia.
That's one choice. Mr. Deacon wouldn't agree with you. I don't know. We seem to be talking about the same lady who is one of the foremost mathematicians, if not the foremost mathematician of that time, known to us now. And it's very striking how magical that mathematics was something to be afraid of. And we do not, at least today in this room, have that fear. I was wondering what the conversation would have been like 2,000 odd years ago in Alexandria. What the hell?
We'd be wearing less clothes for starters, wouldn't we? This is something else I wanted to talk about, this idea of inspiration. And I was going to ask you about inspiration. Obviously, it comes from the Latin inspirare, to sort of breathe in. And I think there would have been a model at that time that you were that ideas come from some greater, more divine place, and you were kind of a channel for them. And I often think it makes you rather sound, whether you're a mathematician or whether you're a writer, it makes you sound rather like God's bagpipes, that you're getting something blown through you, and it's sort of, and you're playing it. And I think
that's very careful for Dawkins' successor to be talking about God's bagpipes. But,
I mean, I think there's now a different model, isn't there? Which is that people often say, "Where do you get your ideas from?" And someone I know, it's a very difficult question to answer. Someone I know says, "I just get Joyce Carol Oates' spare ones, actually." But people have this model that you have something small and it grows into something big. I was asked to contribute to Rizzoli, the sort of art coffee table publisher. We're planning a book called Inspiration. They are asking lots of people, scientists, writers, sculptors, musicians, to give them a couple of paragraphs about something which inspired them. And they'd said it could be a photograph, it could be a sketch, it could be a description. And I thought about it, and I thought, this is completely the wrong way round. Almost never do I find a single thing which grows into something big. More often, I sense there's a cloud or a swarm around my head, and you have to pick a few things out of there, the right things, and then after that, it's just cutting and chopping and refining. Yeah. Miles Davis said something very good. Reputedly, someone said to Miles Davis, "You play so fast and so many notes. How do you choose which notes to play?" And he said, "Well, everyone knows what the notes are. What you need is an automatic shit detector to tell you which are the bad ones. And then you just choose the ones that are left."
Yeah, I would say the process seems almost the opposite to me for a mathematician. That I mean, it isn't a process of cutting down. It is taking a germ of an idea and letting that explode. And I mean, it's interesting. I think mathematicians sometimes forget how much groundwork has been laid to have those aha moments, those inspirational moments. And we often talk about these flashes, and it does feel like a flash when suddenly these connections are made. And it is very much about sort of connecting patterns up somehow, that you suddenly see these two things are really the same side of the same equation. And but the new book I wrote, Finding Moonshine, which is about symmetry, I mean, I tell a story of where symmetry came from, but one of the ideas was to try and talk about the sort of what it's like to do mathematics and that moment when suddenly things click together. But I think mathematicians often like to forget how much groundwork has been put down to that, and actually to get that connection you have to have a...
Here's something I wanted to ask you, which relates to the same question again, going back to Platonic ideas of where maths comes from. Without wanting to go into the philosophy of maths, which I don't particularly understand, given that this maths will sort of last forever, there's a structure that will last forever, do you feel as if you're discovering something or creating something?
Yeah. I mean, that's a classic.
Or is that a whole hornet's nest?
Well, it is a hornet's nest. And the interesting thing is, I think that when you actually discover something I've already said, discover something for the first time, it does feel like an act of creation. That it didn't. I mean, I've discovered symmetrical objects which have weird connections with things called elliptic curves. And when I carved those out and had that moment seeing something, it did feel like I'd created this out of nothing. It was a choice that I'd made to define this structure which had these interesting properties. But in retrospect, it felt like it's there to discover
that it was a logical consequence of
that
the
anyone
logic and the number
and you
system.
see that, the non-Euclidean geometry, it was a kind of zeitgeist. 3 people essentially discovered these new geometries all at the same time. But on the other hand, I've talked to composers that I've worked with, and they say, well, actually, it's not so dissimilar for musicians. We often find that somebody has come up with the same idea as I have, which seemed to me crazy. How can you talk about a piece of music being the same? But it's not, of course, the actual way they compose a thing, but the idea behind it. Actually, yeah, that was the idea I wanted to do as well. So I was kind of curious that there was a sense of discovering things that these musicians had as well. I mean, what about for you? I mean, is it totally an act of creation, or...?
I remember saying to a publisher a long time ago, I was writing a series of children's books, and there were 4 in the series about the same characters in the same sort of situations, and it was like pulling teeth when I got to number 3. And I moaned to my publisher saying, there's only a certain number of stories in the world, and I've used both of them already.
Yeah, I think that's... Perhaps we'll have a question here, yeah.
Hi, Uta Frist. 2 weeks ago or so, in this very room, we had a discussion meeting on talent and autism. And lots of interesting theories were proposed, but we really have basically no idea what the connection is and why this occurs. But one thing was noted at that meeting, and that was that writers and filmmakers were absolutely fascinated by this type, autism and talent together. I mean, I think it's infinitely fascinating, but why is it that writers and filmmakers like it so much?
I think your profession has more of them, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does.
I mean, if we're going to have a competition about this, I happen to know, because there's a great book by Kay Redfield Jameson about manning depression, I think called Touched by Fire.
Okay, right.
And in fact, writers and filmmakers, all people in the arts, what tends to brand them is psychiatric illness. She did a big survey of the likelihood of you needing psychiatric inpatient care if you're an artist. And she does a league table. So when your children choose the artistic professions, you can go to this book. Architects are at the bottom. Architects have the same incidence of needing inpatient care as anyone else. Poets, you can pretty much book your place in a psychiatric hospital right now. And this is measured in terms of suicide attempts and needed inpatient care. And I think the reason for that is there's a common myth that doing art is bad for your head. I think it's the reverse, actually. If you're a child at school who doesn't even think about the inside of your head, if you're very sort of... lots of kids are quite animal. They run like gazelles across the veldt. They're always doing stuff, and they find relationships easy. And then there's another set of kids who feel that how to get from one minute to the next is not entirely obvious. And I think if you're that child, then being able to read or say, once upon a time, and you get access to this parallel universe which doesn't have that difficulty in it, which is completely fluid and plastic. And that's hugely inviting. And I think writers and lots of artists tend to come from that group of people. I mean, I suspect actually the opposite is true. On the autistic spectrum, you probably get fewer in the arts, but I think you obviously get more in the sciences.
Yes,
so maybe there's a similar source of that as well.
Well, I certainly think one thing is that Asperger's and autism, there's a difficulty in negotiating relationships with other people and not quite working out what they're doing. It doesn't seem to apply to any rules, and there is a security, I think, which I recognise, and the characters that I've written about in my books have often sought the security of the mathematical world where everything makes sense and there are no exceptions, and there might be surprises there, but you understand exactly how you got from one to the other. I mean, I think the other interesting thing is this connection between a systematizing brain, which autism seems to be associated with, and almost blinkered. I mean, you have to be incredibly blinkered when you're doing mathematics. You have to cut out the rest of the world and be able to just go hell for leather for one thing. But there does seem to be a connection between an extreme systematizing brain, which is very good at following through mathematical problems, and Asperger's and autism, as I understand it. I mean, there's a very interesting chapter in Baron Cohen's book on the essential difference, something about the extreme male brain, and he has a chapter dedicated to mathematicians, and in particular a mathematician in Cambridge who won the Fields Medal, our version of the Nobel Prize, Richard Borchers, who in an interview in The Guardian sort of said that he'd self-diagnosed himself as having Asperger's, and Baron Cohen was quite interested to see whether this was true, and once he went through the whole thing, it certainly seemed to be he was quite extreme on the Asperger's spectrum. So I think there are a lot of examples, but in some ways they're always the ones that, madness as well. That's when I really get upset. It's so easy to sort of talk about madness and mathematics. You've got people like Cantor, who ended up in a mental institution in Halle in Germany, and to say that the maths sent him mad. I mean, and Nash as well, we have examples, and Gödel. And, these are people who had just, like the whole spectrum of society, had mental health problems.
It's often said about artists as well, but the truth is that if you know anything about psychiatric illness, serious psychiatric illness stops you being creative, just that's it. You can't do that. And these people who did have these problems, they did their work the rest of the time. But I think if you do have a head which wanders all over the place, it gives people a feeling that the world is not obvious. That a lot of people, especially people who have very calm inner lives, the world seems straightforward to them. And that's not a real spur to being creative. If you know that this sense of normalcy you've got, sitting in this room now, is an entirely contingent thing, which may slip away, it makes the world and it makes yourself and it makes thoughts really interesting, because they start to float free and you can move them around and change them. Yeah. Just to be very trivial about it, I was talking to a mathematics fellow at one of the Oxford colleges a few years ago when the entrance test was abolished, quite rightly so that mostly so public school candidates and candidates from state schools had they were more on a level with each other. But he said, I'm interviewing mathematicians. There's no test. I'm going to have to judge people on social skills. It's going to completely wreck the whole thing.
Let's have there's a question at the back there, and we'll also put a microphone here as well.
I think when you described the process of writing and reading, you proposed that there were sort of two moments of freedom. One was the writer, as you said, I think sort of almost out on the moors, trying to envisage where the text should go next. And the other would be the reader, who, when reading whatever the writers put down on the page, would have to visualize all that, and, as you said, would probably do much more writing than a good writer would ever do in a book. And I think that was sort of almost counterposed as against what happens in science, where I think you Marcus, said there are more constraints, there's more operation by logic, and you try to have sort of everyone on the same page, as it were. What I was wondering was whether there was an overlap in this way, that when you think in science, well, what does this really mean? For example, if I'm thinking about a molecular mechanism, these sort of blobs we draw on the page, the arrows we draw to conceptualize what that means. We're not thinking purely in terms of logic. We are thinking in terms of images. Something attacks something. Something is attracted to something. So in a way, we use quite metaphorical language to describe what's going on. What I'm wondering is scientific discovery to some extent driven by these metaphors? The questions that we ask, are they not purely logic, but rather driven by curiosity that comes out of these images, and perhaps quite emotional images? And is there some overlap between science and literature there?
Yeah, I think ultimately when I write the thing down on the page, it wants to have a logical narrative to it, and for me to be able to bring it alive in the minds of others. But I think certainly when I'm actually making mathematical discoveries and I'm off tomorrow to work with my collaborator in Dusseldorf, and the way that we create our mathematics does feel like being out on the moor quite often, and you just don't know, and you've got to make imaginative leaps about, I think I might be able to end up there, but we're not sure how we're going to get there. And interestingly, before you formalize the language, those metaphors and trying to find pictures, I think there's a kind of division between the way mathematicians think. Some think very linguistically, that they're looking for the sort of linguistic structure to help them through this thing, and some view things very pictorially. So the whole of the mathematical thing will be a picture to them, and they'll morph this picture, and then they might have to translate that into language. So I think there are two very different ways of thinking about it. But it's interesting, sometimes you feel there's a limitation in what you can understand because of those the metaphors not being rich enough or the language not. And often the major breakthroughs, the moment when something amazing happens in mathematics, is because somebody's enriched the language. I mean, the ability to see in 4 dimensions comes down to, in a sense, a dictionary which translates geometry into numbers. So Descartes' dictionary ultimately gave you access. The one side of the dictionary just goes so much further, and you get access to 4-dimensional shapes. So there are, I would say, those moments when you enrich the metaphor and enrich the language are those times when suddenly you're almost able to see the world in colour. You've got those names for things in colour, and you can spot the differences, whilst before you were working in black and white. It's kind of
but isn't one of the most interesting thing about both disciplines, both as a practitioner and as the audience, is when you get to that area where the metaphors stop? That's one of the things that has a real pull to it. Often when I think about what I'm trying to write and the books that really thrill me, I remember this picture I saw when I was quite young. I think it's a Dürer woodcut, and it's of a great landscape with a city, and you can see the lowest sphere above the whole scene, and a man has taken a ladder up to that sphere, and he's opened a little window. And what he's looking out onto is the darkness on the outside of the world. And I often think the most thrilling thing about certain types of writing and certain types of science is when you get to the darkness at the edge of the world. And that's where the metaphors stop. And that's why it's so hard to think about the Big Bang or string theory or things on the tiniest scale, because you've stepped over the edge of the metaphors. The metaphors have stopped working. And there's sort of no solid ground under your feet at all. Yeah,
no, I mean, you said we need to talk about death, and actually, you see, I think that's what makes science a living subject. Is always that there's a door and you can't quite see what's going on. I mean, I wonder whether you find this when you finish a book, that it's actually you don't want to go back to that book anymore. It's finished. It's gone. Other people can enjoy it, but actually, when Fermat's last theorem got proved, there was a kind of almost a sense of melancholy in the community, because this is such a great problem and drove us to discover such exciting bits of mathematics, and then suddenly somebody took it away from us, and it wasn't there anymore. It was finished, and maths for me is a living subject because of all the things that I don't understand. I haven't got language to articulate. I want to be up at that window, opening the.
Like lots of other writers I know, I definitely get bad postnatal depression after the end of a book.
Yeah.
Because it's lived with you for so long, and it is shaped slightly. Starting a book is rather like pushing an articulated lorry uphill. Really hard work. And there's a point in the middle where you reach flat ground, and then you think, oh, this is getting easier at last. And then it starts to go downhill, you think, oh my God, and you're sort of hanging onto the bumper at the back. And there's usually a bit of a crash at the end. And then it disappears, and you're suddenly drifting. It's actually really hard. And it's only tempered by the fact that my wife used to say to me, why don't you celebrate at the end of a book when a book is finished? And I say, well, there is no point at which a book is finished. You finish a draft, then you finish another draft, then you're ready to like it or not. And then you get the first proofs back, and then it's publication day, which you can't sense in the air at all because it's a purely abstract date. And then you see it in shops. And so the whole thing is actually very different from writing for television, which I've done before. It's one of the very depressing things about writing for television. A book permeates. I mean, Curious Incident is obviously very, very odd. I mean, it's a bit like avian flu, isn't it? It's swept around the world. And people still write to me from strange places, having just picked it up somewhere. When you write for television, you put a lot of work in. I did an hour-and-a-half screenplay last year, 2 years of quite hard work. You watch it, and it goes past like an Intercity 125, and you think, oh, is that it? And there's no permeation at all.
Yeah. No, I think that's that's why I love maths, because it's there forever. I mean, television is so transitory. It's sort of we had a question here. Lots of hands still up. So
hi,
perhaps we can get a mic down here.
I was also interested in what you said about the overlap or lack of overlap between the sciences and the arts, and I was wondering what you thought about the area of what I suppose might be called craft, because it seems to me that that's perhaps where these rather intellectual pursuits of science and the creative arts come into, as it were, a physical form where there's very tangible constraints. For example, my mother was a mathematician who knitted and who always considered that a very logical product of her mathematical interest to design a pattern on a grid to make things fit a garment. Involved a lot of maths for her. I've recently been on a jewellery making course where that obviously involves a lot of physical constraints about the metals, and again a lot of sort of bringing the physicality into that intellectual activity, and I wonder what you thought about that as possibly an area of genuine overlap.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I did an event at the Royal Festival Hall it was a craft event looking at knitting hyperbolic space. And knitting absolutely is Riemannian geometry, basically. It's manifold structures, and it's wonderful. And what was nice is it actually gave you a very tangible object to explore this hyperbolic space with. So I think it was... And one of the people we had talking had discovered a new mathematical proof about hyperbolic space through exploring the knitting of this hyperbolic surface. So I think that's the genuine challenge to kind of the sci-art interface is, you know, when can you actually get scientists thinking in a new way if they've got something, a new question or a new way of actually getting to grips with these objects. And it was an exciting event because of there were multiple channels going on.
Now, see, I'm going to be contentious again, and I'm going to say that quite interestingly demarcates what I think of as a line between art and crafts. Crafts is often defined by function. You know, if you're making a chair, you have to sit on it. If you're knitting a jumper, you have to wear it. You can see an end point, and there are certain rules to help you get to the end point, because that end point has been reached many times before. Often what you're trying to do with art is surprise people, not let them know there is a particular end point, head off in that direction, and then take them off in another direction altogether. So in lots of art, I think you're setting up expectation and then breaking rules so that people always feel slightly surprised the whole way along. Yeah. And I don't think that happens with craft in quite the same way.
Yeah, I think the craft people would probably have a go at you for that.
Yeah,
that was a big answer.
I have a fight in the toilet afterwards, I'm sorry.
We're going to have time for one last question, I'm afraid, which is down here, before we have to close the thing, I'm afraid. So,
if you were to produce a piece of literature or art about symmetry, you would probably choose reflectional symmetry, and probably something quite concrete, a mirror or reflection in water. Those appear again and again, whether it's through the looking glass or the myth of Narcissus or the Marx Brothers mirror routine. If you're a mathematician exploring symmetry, you're looking at a much more abstract concept that includes not only reflections but translations and rotations and what's the other one? Shear reflections.
Glide,
yeah. So don't you think that as a mathematician you're actually going into an abstract realm that takes you further and further away from the sort of concrete, familiar experiences that have emotional resonance and that work in art and literature?
Well, no. In some sense, I would say that those the objects that I'm exploring are. I mean, I think that's why composers love talking to mathematicians, because those structures. I mean, there's a very interesting sporadic simple group called M12, which actually Messiaen had generated in one of his piano pieces, because he took a couple of permutations, and if you look at what they generated an incredibly interesting symmetrical object. So I think that artists are very sensitive to the interesting ways that symmetries can work, which go beyond just a simple sort of reflection, translation, or rotation. So, and I don't think it loses its emotional buzz, or because it's very abstract or something. I mean, for me, the intricacies of these shapes are so much more interesting in a creative and artistic sense, and I think that's the interesting dialogue between an artist and a scientist, when I can show somebody this interesting structure which they've never seen before, and it has a resonance for them, and you see that happening again and again, certainly between mathematics and music.
It occurred to me when we were talking that we all sort of really want everyone to love maths and everyone to love science and everyone to love art as well. Yeah. Isn't one of the great joys? I mean, and that's quite a big, wide social movement at the moment. And it reminds me of Don Patterson, really great poet, talking about poetry, saying, why are we trying to make poetry accessible for everyone? Isn't it snobbish to feel that the thing we do, poetry, is so great that everyone should have it as well? Why are we appealing to the man on the street? Why don't we just appeal to the people that poetry is written for? If you like difficulty, if you like ambiguity, if you like your head messed around with, this is for you. And we're sitting here hoping that we can somehow bring everyone together. Isn't one of the lovely things about it is that maybe the group of people interested in symmetry and the group of people who are really fascinated by James Joyce's Ulysses are probably of a similar size. Yeah. But the really important thing is not being snobbish and saying the thing we have everyone should be interested in. But what is lovely about it is that you can find a small group of people who are utterly passionate about the same thing, and you can have a fantastic dialogue with those people.
Absolutely, but you know, that's why I'm going to Germany tomorrow to talk to this guy, the one guy who really understands what the hell I'm talking about. And but I think it's really encouraging to see so many people come along tonight. So thank you very much for joining us in this conversation to actually find out about the connection between mathematics and literature.
Thank you.
And I'm going to hand back to our hosts for the evening.
I'm Anne Chisholm, and I'm currently chair of the Royal Society of Literature. And it's fallen to me to say a word or two of thanks to our extraordinarily brilliant and stimulating and entertaining speakers, and to say to them that I represent the lamentable strand in English culture. I gave up maths and science at the age of 14 with a sigh of relief. Somebody in the audience mentioned being frightened. I am terrified of the thought of maths. At least I was more terrified before this evening than I am now. So if you can reach me and show me the excitement and the pleasure and the joy of it, and also by your conversation show what, although you have different languages at the heart of what you do, you share a language as well. But I think that was fantastically exciting. So thank you very, very much for that. And I also would like to thank the people who've worked very hard to bring this occasion together, Martin Taylor and everyone at the Royal Society particularly, but also Maggie Ferguson and everyone at the Royal Society of Literature. We value these events very much because we do think it helps to bridge a gap that ought to be bridged, and because it makes us as writers feel slightly less precious and useless and more in touch with serious thought and reality. I'd like to point out that we have another joint event happening in February, which is connected with the Darwin celebrations for next year, and to say that outside there is some literature about that event and some more about the Royal Society of Literature. But most of all, I want to thank the Royal Society for their hospitality and to thank our speakers.
Thank you very much, Anne. Just take that. So now, just falls to me very quickly to bring matters to a conclusion with just a couple of words from the Royal Society. I want to begin by thanking Anne for her very kind words, well-chosen words. More generally, looking down, seeing people then from the Royal Society of Literature, thank you for being such good partners. This is I think this series is a really excellent series, but to see tonight the creative method in the arts and the science compared, and to see the commonality and to see the differences has really been very stimulating indeed. I always learn little gems at these things, but I had a lot of gems tonight, and I just wrote down a couple of them that I will go away and ponder. One, the fact that you need to leave space for the reader so that they can fill in their own details. That had just completely passed me by, but that's probably the mathematician in me, the autist Asperger's person, dying to get out. And then the other thing is that doing mathematics sort of gives you a sense of security. Well, I've been a mathematician for over 50 years, and I hadn't quite caught on to that one yet, but I'm going to make progress. Anyway, I want to say, of course, thank you to you too, not you just for braving the elements and being here, but for contributing. You too have been conversationalists. But of course, most of all, I am very, very grateful for our two principal conversationalists and for the amusement, the entertainment, and the thought-provoking conversation that you've provided us. Thank you very much indeed.
Well done.